I welcome you. And I welcome you all to the 171st session of the Urban Workshop co-organized by the CPR and the CSH. And today's session will focus on the representation of the city and or the urban in Indian literature. And to speak about this topic, we'll have the pleasure today of hearing Dr. Marianne Hillion. Marianne is presently located in Paris, which is why this session is online. She is a senior lecturer in the English department at the University of Strasbourg in France. And her research focuses on the literary representations of post-1990s Indian cities with a specific focus on nonfiction. So Marianne has published quite a lot, and you have a list of her publications on the announcement of the seminar. Don't hesitate to come back to me if you need more details about her publications. So Marianne is going to tell us today about the politics of contemporary Indian urban writing in English between the epic and the ordinary. So Marianne, you can share your PowerPoint now if you want. And as usual, you'll have about 45 minutes for your presentation, followed by a Q&A of, again, 45 minutes roughly. So dear participants, do not hesitate to post your questions already in the chat box. And we'll come to the questions in about 45 minutes. Okay, Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Urban Workshop and Stephanie in particular for inviting me to present my work. I'm honored and I'm very pleased to present my work in front of specialists and of urban questions and non-specialists in India. And I'm also very pleased because this project partly developed during short research days at the CSH in Delhi in 2017, in 2018. I've also listened to a few sessions, to several sessions of the Urban Workshop before, and it has nurtured my research, so I'm very grateful. This presentation is based on my PhD dissertation, which I defended in 2021, and which I intend to turn into a book eventually. So I hope the presentation will elicit comments, questions that might help me refine my analysis or think my subject a bit differently. So the presentation aims at giving a glimpse of the whole project. There are some aspects that I will skip, obviously, others that I will dwell on. And I'm trying to focus on the aspects that might be of interest to social scientists in particular. So I'll first start with my research process and the theoretical framework for my PhD. Then I'll move on to the dissertation's central argument and the outline of its chapters before reaching its conclusions and before sharing further questions in the prologue, actually. So first of all, I'd like to say that I have always been based in English departments, studying Anglophone literature, post-colonial literature. So my interest in literary urban geographies was first triggered by Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, or Salman Rushdie's The Moor's Last Sigh, and his writing of Mumbai in those novels. Because Rushdie was, when I started studying this, was the Indian writer that had been canonized even in France. And it was also, this interest was also sparked by Amit Chaudhuri's writing of Kolkata. Both these writers reimagined their cities in the light of their memories, because they didn't live in those cities anymore. So their geographies of the cities was, was that of nostalgia for a lost city. And I was also interested in the contrast between these two writers, between Rushdie's gigantism and his exuberant writing of Mumbai, and Chaudhuri's quiet, slow imagination of Kolkata. But as I worked on my doctoral research project and as I expanded my inquiry, I came across other texts, more recent, that were not so much fueled by nostalgia or melancholy, but by the writer's daily experience of Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, and by the accelerated their daily experience of the cities and of their accelerated transformation since the 90s. So writers such as Getu Mehta, of course, with Maximum City, but also Raj Kamal Jha, Rana Dasgupta, Aman Sethi, Siddharth Chaudhary, Sampurna Chatterjee, and so on and so forth. In fact, the 2000s, the turn of the 21st century, witnessed the rise of urban narratives, and it also witnessed shifts in the way the city was approached by the writers. In particular, I think what is striking is the rise of nonfiction. So the next slides are just glimpses of the rise of nonfiction in India in general. I won't read this slide, but it's just an illustration of this, of nonfiction in general, trying to decipher India's new position in the world system as well. And then the next slide is about urban nonfiction, which has been on the rise since the 2000s. This shift in the city, in the way the city was approached in Indian Anglophone literature, were contemporary with the fast-paced urbanization and the fast-paced and uneven development of Indian cities in the wake of the 1991 economic liberalization, which you're all familiar with. So I wanted to investigate the ways in which these texts, both fiction and nonfiction, captured the huge changes underway in Indian cities since the 90s. Now, how did I study those texts? First of all, I think my theoretical approach sort of shifted as I developed my project, because I started with imaginary geographies, the idea of cities as cultural constructs, cities of the mind in Rushdie's terms, because that was the way I think literary criticism approached these texts, even in post-colonial literary studies, in which the spatial turn was prominently idealist or culturalist. So that was, I think, my starting point. But because of what I observed in these texts, in the literary texts themselves, that is the concern with the city as an uneven material and social space, their concern with changing architecture, changing infrastructure, and also because of my research days in India, I think I gradually moved to a more materialist approach to critical geographies in particular, trying not to overlook the systemic power relationships at work in literary production and reception. So I drew on three main research fields. The first one is historical materialism. As I said, I believe that cultural practices are never insulated from social relations of production. And I think that literature is a field which refracts contradictions and tensions in society. So I tried to study the ways new literary forms, I mentioned nonfiction earlier, emerge from a given geographical and historical formation. How do they emerge from this context, and then how they capture this formation? So this draws on Fredric Jameson's approach to culture as expressing the different stages of capitalism. It also draws on Franco Moretti's approach of the world literary system and the Warwick Research Collective, the REC, the REC's work on literature and the world system. So I can come back to that. But basically the idea of that is developed by the REC is that literature from the semi-peripheries of the world system, that is often from the former colonies, register the contradictory experience of capitalist modernity. And they examine how they do this, how literature, how writings from the semi-peripheries register this contradictory experience. So it helps me think the connection between the social context of 21st century India and literary forms arising from it. The second field is critical geographies, which you might be more familiar with. So I draw a lot on David Harvey's work, his understanding of space, of cities as spaces which are instrumental to global capitalism, spaces of capital accumulation produced by capitalism. I use the category of urban entrepreneurialism, for instance. I also use Jennifer Robinson's work on ordinary cities and her criticism of the idea of the global city. More specifically and perhaps more empirically grounded, I draw on urban studies as they are conducted in India, that is urban anthropology and urban sociology, with works such as the ones by Véronique Dupont, Sanjay Srivastava, Asher Gutner, Lila Fernandez, Amita Bhaviskar, and these are just a few names among a myriad other names. So this thesis tries to connect the imaginative production of the city, because it is still, I believe it is still true that the city is a cultural construct, with the city as socially, historically produced. I'm, of course, not the first one to think about this, and these are the various works that address this issue, not necessarily focusing on India, but I have been inspired by Rashmi Varma's work on gender, race, and class in London, Nairobi, and Bombay, on Eleke Bome's and Dominic Davies' work as well about infrastructural violence, and other works. I can give you a full list after this conversation. Now, with those theoretical instruments in mind, my aim in this work is to describe a new urban aesthetic, to investigate the ways in which texts represent the uneven urban development of Indian cities under the pressures of global capital. So these are the questions that you can see here on the slide are the questions I'm asking. Which literary strategies do Indian Anglophone writers develop to refract, that's a term I borrow from Jameson, to refract this phenomenon? Which modes that are specific to the novel or to the reportage or the essay do they use? And a second connected question is, which homology can we establish between these forms and the writer's ideologies? As I read on this text, I think the contrast between Rushdie's gigantism, which I mentioned earlier, and Chowdhury's fragmentary representation of Kolkata appeared again. And drawing on the literary text I studied, I refined my understanding of this opposition. I think this opposition between gigantism and miniaturism could be used as a tool to map this literary production. In his 1991 essay, Huge Baggy Monsters, Amit Chaudhuri, both a writer and a critic, contrasts these two trends. He identifies two lineages of Indian writing in English, not in English, sorry, of Indian literature. So he contrasts what he identifies as the dominant trend, which is gigantism, which is the aesthetic of excess, exemplified by Rushdie's epic novels, with the ambition to encompass all India, to represent all India. He opposes this to another trend, which is miniaturism, which focuses on the everyday, which uses irony, understatements, and which focuses on the local scale. He associates the first aesthetic trend with the triumphant narrative of India's arrival on the global stage. So he associates the first trend with a sort of celebration of India's globalization. The first trend would be complicit with this discourse of India's emergence or arrival. And the second trend, of course, is tied up with a critical or subversive stance. In my work, I also identify a tension, but I question this strict opposition between these two aesthetic modes and their political implications. I think, hugeness or gigantism and miniaturism are always entangled, and complicity and critique are also intermingled in Indian English writing on the city. So I question the relation of Indian urban writing to hegemonic discourses on Indian cities, whether Eurocentric or developmentalist discourses of belatedness, of otherness, but also with discourses celebrating capitalist utopias of world cities. So I recode these terms in the context of urban writing. You have a glimpse here of the text I study, of the material I study. I narrowed down the scope of my study to 10 texts written by 7 writers about 3 cities, Delhi, Bombay, and Kolkata, published between 1991 and 2017. So I can go back to the reasons why I chose this text, the reasons behind this selection, notably the comparative approach between the 3 cities later on during the discussion. I also incorporated a larger number of work in what I call an extended corpus to sustain my argument. So I drew comparisons between this selective corpus, which I studied in detail, and this extended corpus, which enabled me to show the wide interest in the city in Indian contemporary literature. And actually, as you can see here, 2 titles from the extended corpus might end up in the selective corpus, because I think it would be nice to reshuffle things a little bit for the book. Moving on now to my core argument, in my work, I want to discuss the following hypothesis, that is, the contradictory experience of urban uneven development in India is refracted or expressed through the interplay between 2 main aesthetic impulses or modes, which are referred to as the epic and the ordinary. So these are the terms I use to recode or to redefine Amit Chaudhuri's opposition. In the text I study, these 2 modes, the epic and the ordinary, are used to offer a critical view of urban transformations. It might be interesting to look at texts which are not critical of this fast-paced and uneven development, but most of the texts I found were actually critical. So the dissertation examines this interplay between the 2 modes in 2 parts, focusing first on the epic mode and then on the ordinary mode. I can go back to the genealogy of these categories in the discussion, but I define them in terms of rhetoric, of theme, and of scale. So just to tell you a few words about the epic and the ordinary mode before moving on to the chapters. The epic mode, as it manifests in this text, is defined by an amplifying movement. It is based on an inflated rhetoric. The use of the hyperbole is very striking, which intensifies the shock of urban transformation. Thematically speaking, it focuses on the violent collision of antagonistic social forces. So it focuses on conflicts, on collisions. And these are aligned with a predominant macroscopic scale of representation, with spectacular panoramic views of the city of Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata, revealing these texts totalizing ambition. Now, the ordinary mode is defined by a sort of deflating movement. In terms of rhetoric, it tones down the shock of urban transformation. It conveys a sense of familiarity with the city. It is often based, in terms of rhetoric, it is often based on understatement, irony. It's closer to realism. And it explores urban development through the lens of the everyday. So social conflicts are often in the background. The scope is restricted to a micro scale, right? The scale of the locality, of the neighborhood. I call them street corner narratives. And I see these two modes are modes or impulses or movements rather than genres, because the text fluctuate between the two. I think these are, coordinates that help us examine this text, but they do not exhaust their potentialities. I think there are many ways of reading this text, and I use this tension between the two modes as one way of reading them. So as I said, this dissertation is divided into two parts, into 6 chapters. You have the titles of each chapter here. And I'll give you a glimpse of the chapters, dwelling on some of them in particular. So the first chapter, examines the apocalyptical urban landscapes depicted in various narratives, notably Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Raj Kamal Jha's She Will Build Him a City, and Rana Dasgupta's Capital. These narratives are rather pulled towards the epic mode. Through panoramic views of Delhi and Mumbai, and through the metaphorical network of natural disaster, they heighten the shock of material and social destruction involved in this urban modernization. So in these texts, instability or perpetual change in Delhi and Mumbai is not perceived as something which is creative, which is exhilarating, but on the contrary, it is perceived as something which is excruciating. So Rana Dasgupta in Capital portrays Delhi in the 2000s as a city bursting out of its seams, as an eruption. It's this eruption in the 21st century is embedded in a longer history of eruptions of the city. Raj Kamal Jha also describes the birth of New City in his novel, which is actually a fictional version of Gurgaon, as a cataclysm, as a meteor fall, as the mutilation of the earth. So it's something monstrous. And I'll develop one example that I find particularly striking to show the way the renewal of urban space is represented as a catastrophe and a cover-up. So it comes from Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is partly set in Delhi. And the third chapter of the novel narrates the miraculous appearance of a baby in the middle of the night on a pavement and the rebirth of Delhi as a magnet for tourists and foreign investors. So this is the only chunk of text that I will read in this presentation, but I think it's particularly striking. Around her, the city sprawled for miles. 1,000-year-old sorceress, dozing but not asleep, even at this hour. Grey flyovers snaked out of her Medusa skull, tangling and untangling under the yellow sodium haze. Sleeping bodies of homeless people lined their high, narrow pavements, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, looping into the distance. Old secrets were folded into the furrows of her loose parchment skin. Each wrinkle was a street, each street a carnival. Each arthritic joint a crumbling amphitheater where stories of love and madness, stupidity, delight, and unspeakable cruelty had been played out for centuries. But this was to be the dawn of her resurrection. Her new masters wanted to hide her knobby, varicose veins under imported fishnet stockings, cram her withered tits into mauve padded bras, and jam her aching feet into pointed high-heeled shoes. They wanted her to swing her stiff-walled hips and reroute the edges of her grimace upwards into a frozen, empty smile. It was the summer grandma became a whore. She was to become super capital of the world's favorite new superpower. The city is first presented here as both exhausted and sublime, with her Medusa skull suggesting her formidable power, but also her loss of vitality. And her wrinkled skin also reminds the reader of Anjum, the novel's protagonist, who is, suffering, but also unflappable. She's also very resilient. And then this old sorceress of Delhi is forcibly rejuvenated to herald the advent of a new India, of a makeshift new India. Her body is dressed up, it's corseted, and it's violently exposed. So we shift here from the trope of the city as a mother or as a grandmother to another trope, that of the city as a prostitute. But what is interesting here is that Roy turns the trope of the alluring city, the city as a temptress, on its head, because the city is no longer imagined as a temptress, but as a victim of its new masters. She's not dangerous, she's exploited by her new masters, and she's turned into an object of exhibition and consumption. So the text shifts, the connotation of the trope of city as an artificial creature to anti-capitalist politics. It also reveals Roy's reverence for the rich history of Delhi and her anger when faced with its destruction. So this example is one among many, which reveals how these texts register the aestheticization of urban space. This aestheticization of urban space has been analyzed in the context of Delhi in particular by Véronique Dupont, by D. Asher Gertner, through his idea of the rule of aesthetics. So what happens in those texts is that they create a counter-imagination of the city, a counter-aesthetics to that of the clean slate city, of the tabula rasa, of the idea of complete renewal, by showing the cracks of the surface. They show that, there's no such thing as a clean slate. There's always, the past always finds a way of re-emerging. So they also develop the idea of the spectral presence of the past, of the multiple layers of the city. Now, the second chapter scales down the inquiry from landscapes, architecture, and infrastructure to social relationships in the city. And the epic mode gives prominence to, as I said, to the collision of antagonistic social forces. So these texts dive head-on into social conflicts, into physical and psychological violence, and they often revolve around historical episodes of violence, such as the Babri Masjid riots, and the riots in Bombay in 1992-1993, Gujarat in 2002, or several murders and lynching of Dalits. So the chapter explores, the idea of divided cities, of foregrounding collisions and divisions between social classes in the city. And this ties in with, the idea of the epic as the collision of various forces. Now, chapter 3 locates this text in a wider field of discourses on urban modernity. It also addresses, the ideological implications of this aesthetics of shock and excess. So the question I'm asking in chapter 3 is, do these narratives of crisis actually tap into Orientalist cliches of colonial otherness, of monstrosity? Do they tap into Eurocentric narratives of, post-colonial cities having to catch up with the West? This is what Jennifer Robinson or Ravi Sundaram argues about what they call dystopian urbanism. But what I argue is that the texts I look at do not partake of dystopian urbanism for two reasons. First of all, the amplifying movement that I've described does not perpetuate an exoticizing gaze on the cities, but this amplifying movement, I think, dramatizes the contradictions of uneven development in general as it manifests in urban space. In other words, the landscapes they draw and their futurism, I can come back to this term, do not set Indian cities apart in a realm of disquieting fantasy, but they show them as representative of a global urban condition in any capitalist formation. They rely on local myth, on local narratives, and they attend to the specific historicity of Delhi and Mumbai, but they also rely on the global frame of reference, which enables them to put forward a sort of global urban comparativism. So what this text register is not how belated the cities are or how futuristic they are, but how capitalism works at the scale of each Indian city. I think the second reason why they do not belong to dystopian urbanism is that they aim to decolonize our imagination of what a desirable city is. They aim to puncture the neoliberal utopia of the world-class city. The main instrument of their political critique is the amplification of unevenness, because these writers believe in the critical power of anger, of grief, and fear as engines of political change. So they rely on these emotions, on these strong emotions to perhaps bring awareness about the unevenness of these cities. Now, the next 3 chapters explore urban narratives that lean towards the ordinary mode. I think in those texts, this mode also serves to counter dominant narratives, but they deflate rather than inflate the crisis. In this second part, I'm looking at writings by Amit Chaudhuri, by Aman Sethi, Sonia Falero, and Siddharth Chaudhuri. So chapter 4 draws on the hypothesis of microhistory to show that changing scale brings out a different cartography of Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata. Enlarging the view or focusing on the neighborhood leaves room for individual agency, for the exploration of the intricate fabric of social relationships, for the exploration of how a locality is constructed, whether it is the Para in Kolkata or the Mohalla in Delhi. And I argue that these narratives downsize Indian so-called maximum cities. They push back the imaginary of the chaotic megacity, but also of Indian cities as monuments of Indian new global modernity. So, for instance, I examine Aman Sethi's reportage about a migrant laborer in Delhi. I examine the writer's ethnographic gaze, which closely describes the neighborhood of Bharatuti Chowk in Delhi, its institutions, its alliances and conflicts, its daily rhythm. I do the same with Siddharth Chaudhuri, with his writing of street corners in Patna and Delhi. So moving on from this idea of street corner narratives, I move on in chapter 5 to the question of time, of rhythm. The idea is that these texts write everyday life in the city, which does not imply escaping history or escaping social conflicts, but it focuses on the reverberations of these social conflicts in everyday life. The major historical events are always in the background or obliquely treated. The rhetorical restraint, the understatements, the subdued tone, also alternates with mock heroic inflation of daily events. I can again go back to this idea of the mock epic a bit later. And finally, chapter 6 shows that the ordinary mode constitutes another aesthetic strategy to counter the narratives of India's chaotic cities or world-class cities. They are at odds with, the epic's focus on spectacular eruptions, but they challenge these triumphant discourses in two ways. The first is that they emphasize characters who are out of sync with the neoliberal turn of India and its worship of individual success. All the characters drift, meander, circle. They do not want to make it in the city. And the narratives also stress invisible or small-scale strategies of resistance to an uneven social order rather than great collisions. And the second ways in which they debunk dominant narratives is that they show the various ways in which precarity is dealt with away from cliches of victimhood and passivity. They look at spaces of relative autonomy that evoke the possibility of a more just city. So I use the concept of real utopias developed by Eric Olin Wright to argue that, these spaces of relative autonomy could be way stations on the road to bigger social change. They are not a retreat from political struggle, but they show the way. And again, Arundhati Roy's novel is a very significant example that I won't develop, but I will just allude to the fact that the Muslim graveyard in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness becomes Jannat Guest House, and it appears as the paradigm of this small-scale real utopias, because the inhabitants claim their right to the city through the reclamation of this minoritarian space. It's the site where all the urban outcasts gather in the novel, and they are given voice and agency in the quiet companionship of the dead. So there's also a connection with history. I'll come back to the political limitations of the writer's emphasis on individual agency in a second, because I'm reaching my conclusion now. So conclusion and further questions. First of all, what I have tried to develop in this dissertation is a theoretical model. I have tried to define an urban aesthetics intention. I think it delineates the aesthetic and political features of contemporary Indian urban writing, the way this text critically reflects on the radical changes that have been underway in Indian cities since the 90s, through the interplay between two modes, the epic and the ordinary. And I'm very aware that these narratives are embedded in the wider field of representations, academic, political, academic discourse, political discourse, marketing discourse. The cities of the global south, Indian cities and the cities of the global south are, the object of many discourses. And I think there are definitely echoes between literary texts and these discourses. I have identified echoes between Arundhati Roy and Mike Davis, for instance. And with that in mind, I would like to briefly sketch two avenues of research that extend my reflection and that I'm still exploring. So I'm not sure I have answered the two questions I'm going to submit now. The first one deals with the link between the writer's position and the social scientists' position and their approach to urban inequalities, to urban precarity. And I think the notion of miserabilism and populism could be useful. So I'll briefly tell you why. I think that, so this is mostly connected with the ordinary mode. I think the ordinary mode, with its full grounding of the character's agency and bricolage of tactics to survive in the city, might be, unintendedly lead to the praise or the celebration of adjustment, of adaptation, and of individual ingenuity, individual, skills and individual autonomy, perhaps leading to the obscuring of the social structures that underpin these individuals' situation. And this optimistic narrative of urban precarity is what Ananya Roy calls subaltern urbanism. And I know it's a whole debate. I mean, I think it's a whole debate in urban studies. So we can come back to Ananya Roy's argument, but I think it connects quite interestingly with what sociologists Grignon and Passeron have identified as miserabilism and populism in social sciences. That is, how do we approach a social group which is not ours? And they argue that populism is a trap in the sense that it overemphasizes people's autonomy at the risk of turning a blind eye to domination processes. I argue, however, that the narratives I'm looking at, such as Sonia Falero's Beautiful Thing or Aman Sethi's A Free Man, escape or avoid this trap. Because even though they foreground their protagonist agency, they also gesture to, systemic unevenness and to the contradictions that shape these individual trajectories, that circumscribe their field of possibility. However, they also insist on the opposition between the individual and society, and they do not foreground collective resistance. The second one, and this will be my last point, the second avenue of research that I want to explore is the value or the value of using different analytical scales. I think what a historical, geographical, materialist approach enables us to do, using the world system theory and using different scales of analysis, is perhaps to test the model I develop in two ways. The first one would be to extend the scope of my investigation to other cities around the world, particularly in the global south, so we can identify affinities between, Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata, and Johannesburg, Nairobi, Lagos, or cities in the Middle East. So this would be an interesting avenue, whether this tension between the epic and the ordinary is extensible. And the other one works the other way around. That is, reading these texts through this lens also enables me to connect these metro cities with their hinterland or with so-called medium cities. That is what Siddharth Chaudhary does with Patna and Delhi, even though Patna is a large city. They are shown to belong to the same cultural sphere, and I think it would be interesting to study whether the tension between the epic and the ordinary is visible in narratives of medium cities, because these cities, as we know, have been incorporated into global capitalism in a different way. And because this process has been studied by geographers, Marie-Hélène Zerra in particular, I think it would be interesting to see whether this tension between the epic and the ordinary is it specific to cities of the global south, to the semi-peripheries of the world system, or is it specific to Indian urbanity in general? I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks to you for keeping time. This was really a challenge. I think that presenting a whole PhD in 45 minutes is definitely a challenge, but you did an excellent job of it. So perhaps you can now stop the PowerPoint so that, we can see you better. And yes, it was a very rich presentation, a very dense one, but also a very clear one. And it's extremely stimulating. I mean, as I told you in the urban workshop, we don't have a lot of presentations focusing on literature. So it's extremely stimulating. And I have a lot of questions. So dear participants, please feel free to let us know, in the box. If you have any question, you can, either write your question, or I can, Arnaz at the CPR can unmute you. And to start the discussion, where shall I start? Yes, could you tell us, Marianne, could you tell us a few words about your methodology? I mean, this is especially important as I think many of us here, ordinary participants in the urban workshop are from social sciences and not from a literature I mean, we don't come from a literature studies perspective. So could you tell us how you proceed? And my question more particularly would be, have you focused really on on the texts themselves, the many texts you have mentioned, or have you also considered, the larger creative industry around the text? For instance, have you done interviews with, I don't know, authors, publishers, booksellers? So what is the perimeter of your empirical work, so to speak?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so that my primary material is consistent in text, but the way I study them, I always try to study. I study them, I think, on different scales again, because I study the way the plot is structured, but also the way the characters navigate the city, depending on their, on their social position, on their positions in terms of gender, of class and caste. And as I said, I also study rhetorical devices. So tone, yeah, I think this is what I refer to as, an inflated rhetoric, or the rhetoric of understatement, toning down or amplifying. So I look at text in this way, trying to connect both themes and forms and literary forms. But then it was very important for me to look at text as part of to look at text as literary productions. So who produces them, how they are produced. So even though my work is not, strictly speaking, a work of sociology of literature, I try to situate these writers in the global literary market, because this is quite a successful segment of literature in the global literary market. So I try to study, the writer's interest in the city as, resulting from a global interest in cities, in Europe, in the United States. So I look at their position as Indian writing in English, right? So I factor in, if you wish, the fact that they write in English about Indian cities. So of course, it shapes the way they represent the city. They belong to an urban educated elite. They address an Indian elite and a global elite, and that frames their representations. And I have done interviews with a number of writers and publishers. I quoted Arpita Das in my PowerPoint. But yeah, I interviewed a few of them, trying to investigate their relationship to the city, their own experience of the city, and the way they capture that in their texts. But this is something I would like to develop as well. And I think it's very important not to think of the text as an insulated bubble.
Right, thank you. So we have two questions in the chat. So Sunil has a question. Sunil, do you want to ask your question live? I think Arnaz will unmute you. Sunil Kumar. Okay. I don't know if Sunil is still with us. Yeah. Okay, please do ask your question.
Can you, okay, you unmuted me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm not sure why my camera is not showing, but anyway. I just wondered, Mariana, that the actual lived experience of urban residents, and I'm drawing a lot upon my younger days in Chennai, are so different. Are in a way something that one has to deal with issues as and when they arise. So, for example, I remember when I was about 10 or 11, my parents got almost evicted from the place where they were living. And that trauma has only appeared in my life about 30, 40 years ago. At the same time as those who are writing about cities are writing to represent. And I'm just wondering to what extent they are able to engage with the kind of affects of such experiences. I don't know if I've made myself clear.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. I think they do. I think what I find interesting, for instance, in texts which are drawn towards the ordinary mode, is that they deal with the ordinariness of the crisis. So they deal with they do not so much deal with spectacular events, but with the ways in which the crisis is embedded in everyday life. So, for instance, in Sampurna Chatterjee's short stories, which are set in Mumbai, there are a number of tragic episodes that are described. There's at some point a flood, and then there's at some point a man self-immolating. There are evictions as well, but they are told through the point of view of someone who has to deal with it, to survive, and to so there's a lot of pragmatism, and so this is one way of dealing with with trauma, I think. And another way, and this is very palpable in Arundhati Roy or in other narratives in which the trauma of being evicted from your own place or or seeing your own place being destroyed is amplified or is dramatized because they want to convey anger, they want to convey outrage at the unfairness of the situation. So I think they do deal with the real experience of the city, but in different ways.
So if I can just come in here, it was not so much about, my question was not so much about whether it's dealt with or not. I suppose my question, I don't expect an answer, it's more of a kind of reflection, was between the idea of compassion and empathy. And one could be compassionate by listening to what our respondents are telling us, to document and to express that in a certain way. But the empathy element comes from actual lived experience. And therefore, the lived experience of these literary authors, they can speak to that, but how do they speak to the lived experience of others? It's a much more questions around, I think, more a philosophy of representation, but also perhaps an ethics of representation in the sense that this is representation rather than saying, I have expressed this.
Of course,
and I think, so that is where because I use a lot of, I draw a lot on this kind of fiction writing in my teaching as well. But I tell my students that this is the limitation that I find, and I'm still searching for ways in which that gap can be bridged. So, for example, if I tell a story from my life to my students, that's my story, and they might understand it, but if they haven't experienced it, it doesn't convey the same kind of intensity than if they had.
Right. Yeah. It's indeed a very white question of representation, representing someone, who's not you, who doesn't necessarily have the same social position. I think this I don't. You might be familiar with this book, A Free Man by Aman Sethi, but
Yes,
I
I
think
have.
right. So I think it's a good example of a of a writer trying to be as close as possible to his interviewee, but constantly reminding the reader that there's an unbridgeable distance between him and his interviewee. So he
Yeah.
doesn't pretend, right? He never identifies with him. And on the other hand, you might have come across the book Trickster City, which in this case is based on testimonies, and I mean, these are stories, vignettes written by inhabitants of Delhi, and they have been translated by social scientists and writers, but in this case it's self-representation. And I think this is something I haven't investigated, but I would like to look at Dalit literature, for instance, to explore a different positionality in the city, and yeah to yeah. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting.
Thanks. We have a lot of other questions by now. So the next one is by Sakshi Dogra. It's both a question and a comment. So Sakshi, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Marian. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I myself am a PhD candidate at an Indian university. This is Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi. And while you were presenting, I was wondering if there are instances in the texts that you select where miserabilism is toned down. I'm thinking what happens when we follow the logic of other life forms who know how to avoid ruination. And I'm sort of thinking how this kind of post-human lens then can perhaps assist in answering questions that I felt were perhaps left unanswered towards the end, because mushrooms, microbes all require decaying material as sustenance. Through processing what is rotten, these life forms then create conditions for a new life. So I was wondering if you see characters in these texts who are able to build a new life out of ruination, that is the Indian city. Because I also sense that, I mean, just now you were answering a question and you spoke about trauma and resilience, and which are all sort of to my mind, human affects or human experiences. I was just wondering that city as a space which is inhabited, by non-humans too. If you could comment on such a representation in the texts that you have selected.
Thanks. This is not something I have investigated in my dissertation, but I think it's a very rich field. There's a text which might be of interest if you want to explore this. And again, you might be familiar with it, but it's Nilanjana Roy's The Wildings, in which one neighborhood is Delhi is explored through the vantage point of cats, and I think it was published a while ago, but since then other narratives have come up which explore the non-human inhabitants of the city. In my text, what what pops up now is the way Arundhati Roy also in her novel brings in non-human perceptions of the city. So it's not necessarily about microbes or micro entities, but it's about dogs, horses, birds that are constantly interacting with human characters, and I think she draws connection between the human and the non-human world in this way. Then again, in Raj Kamal Jazz, She Will Build Him a City. There's also a whole again, you might know this novel, but there's a whole passage about a cockroach, which
Yep.
is super, yeah. So this this comes to mind when you I mean in connection with what you mentioned, because it's a sort of spectral life, but which suggests that you know, the past is never obliterated, and these farmers, because the cockroach is the sort of reincarnation of a farmer's son, which I mean the farmer has been dispossessed from his land. The cockroach is also magnificent in the novel, and perhaps there would be an example of you know, well, the idea of persisting life form in spite of surrounding ruination. But I'd be interested in reading your work if you're interested in, if you're, you know, if you're exploring this non-human life in the city.
I'll find a way to share it with you. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed.
Thank you. So the next question is by Rajiv Shukla. I don't know if Rajiv is online. Yeah, Rajiv, can you ask your question? Anas, can you unmute? Yeah, Rajiv, he seems to be still muted on my screen. Okay, there seems to be a problem here, so I'm going to read Rajiv's response, and if you can be unmuted, perhaps you can elaborate then. So Rajiv asks, isn't the dichotomy of the personal and the political an integral part of literature across the world? For instance, war as a backdrop to a romance. So how is the dual mode of the epic and the ordinary distinct from that well-established structure?
Thank you for your question. So the way I understand the epic and the ordinary is not it's not an opposition between the personal and the political, because both are political. But I use these terms being aware that it's sort of it draws on existing oppositions. For instance, the you know, the famous debate between the merits of realism as opposed to the merits of modernism, you know, or between realism and what some Marxist literary critics have called irrealism. So I think to some extent I would rather locate the duality of the epic and the ordinary in the wider debate of realism and irrealism, because I don't see them as, I understand that because the ordinary has this narrow scope and the micro scale, we might think about it as personal as opposed to the political. But what I'm trying to show in the dissertation is that it's also it's you know, it's highly political, and I don't think you can disentangle the two.
Okay, so Anas, are you still with us? Can you unmute Rajiv, because I can't do it apparently from my side. And
I tried doing it, but it's not happening. Like, I allowed him to talk, but I think he did not unmute or something.
Oh, okay. So sorry about that, Rajiv, but if you have another question, please put it in the chat box. And we now turn to Anshul Sharma, who has posted first a comment and then a question. So Anshul, hopefully, yes, now you were unmuted. Please go ahead with your question and comment if you want.
Thank you. Thank you for the time. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I work on urban studies, and I specifically look at urban legal codes. So I am constantly thinking about the boundaries of my raw material. And I liked the presentation a lot because I think it allowed me to look at urban literature and urban prose, which I really admire, and look at it also as sound raw material in thinking about urbanization. I constantly grapple with thinking about how Ananya Roy's work could be reconciled with uh, urban writing and urban prose, and Catherine Du and Arundhati Roy and these writers. And in that sense, I think this presentation helps me think through these intersections. I am curious to how to operationalize this, and I'm curious if you have thought of this, if we can effectively integrate urban studies theoretical frameworks, which sometimes tend to be quite complex. If we can integrate them with the narrative techniques of urban literature to maybe think through issues of sustainability and social justice. These are very personal issues that I work with in my own dissertation on sustainability and social justice in South Asian cities. So I'm curious how to make those bridges more apparent and strengthen them, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for your comment and your question. I'm not sure I can answer right away. I think I would need to think about this. I think I try to integrate, urban studies categories and ways of understanding urban space in the way I look at text. So in literary analysis, and I try to do it with the idea of with Jennifer Robinson's idea of the ordinary city, or even with the rule of aesthetics, for instance, developed by Dheashwar Gupta. But yeah, in relation with sustainability and social justice, I think I would need to think a bit more about it. There are some works on Catherine Du's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and its connection with social justice and with the idea of whether the subaltern can speak, which is quite topical at the moment in India. But so I can, I'd be happy to share these references if they help you think about your topic.
Sure. Thank you, Marianne. Really appreciate it.
Okay, and then we have a question by Pankaj Srivastav that I actually would like to read because I would like to add a little bit to it. So Pankaj is asking, have you visited any of the 3-4 cities you delve on based on the writings of these authors? And I would add to this question, if you have visited them, was it after reading some of the texts you have mentioned or before? Because of course we know that our imagination is shaped by, what we read, what we see, etc. And I think that inherent to the question of the politics of writing is very much, the impact such writing, especially when it's popular, can actually shape the way we see the cities in question.
Thank you very much. Just to pick up on what you said, Stephanie, I think it works with literature, but it's even more, I think it's even more significant with cinema, right? The way, and in particular in the case of Mumbai, but even Delhi, which features more and more in popular Hindi cinema. I think, I think cultural works, including literature, impacts the way we see cities. I have visited Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata and other cities in India before. I visited them after reading Midnight's Children, but before reading all the texts that I studied in my dissertation, because I started, staying in India or visiting the cities in 2012. So much before I started my PhD in 2016. I think it helped me a lot. I think it was, it was necessary. I couldn't have studied these texts without having an empirical experience of the cities, however biased, however limited my experience is, of course. But I think it helped me get a sense of their geographical and historical specificities in terms of urbanism, of urban organization. And sometimes it also helped me, I think, get away from a distant view of, I don't know, for instance, of Delhi as this I think it helped me get away from the opposition between the urban and the rural, for instance, or the idea of the way a neighborhood works, and the way sometimes social ties from a rural area, from a village, or from a medium city are brought over to the city, and they are reframed, and they become something urban. But I think visiting them, staying in these cities, helped me realize this. And I think perhaps getting away from the idea of Delhi as an unbeloved city, or as a fragment. It is fragmented, but yeah, it just gave me a different perspective on it, even though it's I don't claim it's endless, right? It's so I don't claim I know these cities by heart, but it's and just to conclude, I think at first, for instance, when I visited Mumbai, I was very much I wanted to go and see Malabar Hill. I wanted to go and see Marine Drive because of Midnight's Children and because of other narratives of Bombay. And I think these are landmarks which first guided me, and then I think I moved away from them by talking to people and and understanding that there were other neighborhoods that were very interesting to investigate. Or even the textile mills in Bombay, I think I was very drawn to these landmarks, and the impact. I mean, the impact is very difficult to study, but I think the impact of Maximum City on foreign visitors is huge, and that that could be considered as a problem. But yeah.
How so? Can you elaborate on that? What is the problem?
No, I don't mean to frame this in moral or ethical terms, but it's just that it's often the first work that people abroad mention when they think of Mumbai. And what I study in the second chapter, for instance, is the way Suketu Mehta intends to study the myth of the city. So he consciously explores and amplifies everything that is sensational, that is mythical about the city. He also builds on the cinematic image of Bombay. So he's not writing a realist reportage. He's writing a sort of noir reportage, and he enjoys this, and he pictures himself as a spectator. So some scholars have described it as a cabinet of curiosities, or as perpetuating the idea of Bombay as the heart of darkness. He's fascinated with otherness. So I think as I'm trying to study that as a literary strategy, also to appeal to his American readers. And it's one strategy among others, but I think it mustn't be the only, the only glimpse. I mean, I think it's a shame if it's the only image of the city that people have, even though it's yeah. Also, I need to add that this text was published in 2004. And I think it's very palpable. Perhaps Sunil Kumar will add something, but it's quite different from my other text because it's more optimistic than text written in the 2010s and especially after 2014. So his text is perhaps less. It's also more liberal. It's about how exhilarating the competition between self-interest is in the city. And in that sense, it's quite different from Rana Dasgupta's text or Aman Sethi's text.
But so precisely, to what extent is it possible to objectify readership, especially with regard to the text you have studied and told us about today? I suspect it's a very complex question to treat methodologically, but broadly, my question would be, what sells more in India, what sells more abroad? I mean, in between the genre, revolving around the epic and the books revolving around the ordinary, to put it very roughly. So would the epic sell more than the ordinary? Does the epic meet more with commercial success and the ordinary more with critical success? I mean, that is very broadly a hunch, but it might be completely wrong. Do you have any way to objectify this and to actually treat this very, very rough hypothesis? Let us put it like that.
It is. I mean, it is both. Fascinating and difficult because I haven't had access to figures. Sometimes one figure is mentioned, or several figures are mentioned here and there, but there's no public access to publishers' figures. The way I think one material I can draw on, but again it's very biased and specific, is literary reviews in the US, in the UK, or in European countries and in India, and that's a first hint at how the book is received, how by literary critics, and then I think what I tried to show in chapter 3 is that indeed I'm not sure about the actual readership, but I guess the epic mode has more affinities with writers published both in India and abroad. And I think Rana Dasgupta is a good example because he really writes about Delhi as an example of a global process, and he wants to locate Delhi in on the world stage. So I don't know if it sells more, but I guess it's more attuned. In my view, it's more attuned to a global readership. I also studied texts which are only published in India. For instance, Siddharth Chaudhary's work or Sampurna Chatterjee's works are published by Aleph or by Penguin India. They are not. They do not circulate in the UK or in the US. And I guess in the case of Chaudhary, for instance, in the case of the Patna Manual of Style, which I believe is leans towards the ordinary mode. It definitely it addresses an Indian Anglophone audience. But I'm not sure we can actually identify a strict, a strict correspondence between the modes and their readership, because Urban Cities of Free Man, was published with critical acclaim in the US, and because there's a whole tradition of urban literary journalism in the US as well. So I think the Ordinary Mode can also cater to non-Indian audience. But there might be ways of accessing, publishers' figures. I think we know them when they sell when they sell a lot. But this is something I would like to explore, because we can, these are assumptions about readership, but it would be it would be nice to objectify them. Or this is sociology of literature, but I think the way, last thing I want to add is the way these texts might be included in syllabi in universities in India and abroad. I think that's also a good sign of how, institutionalized they are, how they are studied. This could be another interesting factor to take in.
Right, because precisely by talking about politics of writing and of urban writing, you basically open up all these possible avenues of exploration. And I understand that it's not possible to cover everything even within a PhD. I also understand that what is specific to art is ambiguity, and I think you have shown that to us in a very compelling way. But the other aspects of the questions are perhaps less ambiguous. So the question of marketing strategies, how publishing houses design the covers, to basically convey, in very concrete ways what you told us about, glamorizing, in a way, glamorizing, the gigantism and the horror in some ways of Indian megacities. Also, the intentions of the authors. This is something on the other side of the process, and I don't know to what extent it's possible to go into that. And of course, the impact of the published book itself, which is what you have just elaborated upon. So another question I would have, and I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but okay, I'll ask my other question later. Now Parto has a question. Parto, do you want to ask your question? Sorry, Parto Mukhopadhyay.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Thanks, Marianne. I was just wondering, sort of two things. One, do these this epic and the Ordinary Mode, do they require these? Most of the work that you've been citing is largely around the big metros. So do they require metropolitan stages? Is a metropolitan stage a necessary platform for these things to play out? Or do you think that these kinds of binaries could also play out in sort of smaller cities? That's one. And just out of curiosity, are you familiar with Ankh-Morpork, Terry Pratchett?
With, sorry?
Are you familiar with Terry Pratchett's work? He's a fiction novelist.
No. Yeah,
No.
I think if you could just write the name down in the questions and answers, that
I'll try and put that down.
Sorry, because the sound is a bit unclear.
Okay. You have the question. I'll just put down the
Yeah, it's in the chat box.
Yeah.
You have the title and more book. And I think you said Terry Pratchett?
Yes.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett and Ankh Morpork. Okay. Thank you so much. If I may, I just wanted to pick up on what Stephanie said about marketing, because just to give you an example of how interesting this is, in the case of A Man Set is a Free Man, the marketing and the blurbing and the summary on the back cover of are quite different from what's inside the book. So I think the practice of blurbing could be very interesting to study, because it's not something we have in France. It's something, and I think who recommends the book, who is quoted on the cover is very interesting. And in the case of A Free Man, the summary of the story gives a sense of a rise and fall trajectory of a downfall, rather, not rise and fall, but just the downfall of a man from middle class to the streets of Delhi. And it has this very clear trajectory that is not there in the book. So it's just I think it's just very significant that the book is framed as a downfall story, or as the book is precisely about how there's no clear causality, how it's very difficult to reconstruct the trajectory of this character. But I'd love, marketing strategies, and they have been studied by Sarah Bruyette, by Graham Hagen in the case of post-colonial literature, but I'm very interested in this. And to come back to your question about, the metropolitan stage that would be needed for the epic mode, I don't think so. I think it could, and this is, the first or the second avenue of research that I suggested at the end of my presentation, but I would like to test, right, this duality on medium cities or smaller towns. There's a book by Mahesh Rao, which is set in Mysore, which could very much belong to the epic mode, even though it's always intermingled. But this is a material I want to investigate, and my intuition is that this duality could be replicated in smaller cities, or but perhaps in different ways, because as you have shown, they also incorporated in global capitalism in a different way, and so it's it's a different kind of globalization as well. But there's a book which has just come out by Sumana Roy called The Provincials. It's nonfiction. That could be interesting material, because she looks at she uses the term intentionally, but she looks at smaller cities, Mofusim towns as they used to be called. Anis Zaidi's Prelude to a Riot, I think, is set in the southern town as well. And yeah, but that's fascinating. I'll look into it.
Well, sorry, can you give us the title of Mahesh Rao's book, set in Mysore?
It's The Smoke is, I think it's The Smoke is Rising. I'll just check.
Okay.
The Smoke is Rising. Yeah. And you can, it's about the transformation of the city, but also the relationship between two elderly people. But it's an interesting case. Yeah.
Okay. So I come back to my other question. Actually, I have two shorter questions. The first one, I was a bit intrigued when you said at the beginning of your presentation that you were focusing on critical texts. And again, I'm really not from a background of literature studies, so I might very well ask very, very naive questions, but I was wondering what is a not critical text, and with regard to the type of writing you're looking at, what would be a non-critical text? And the second question is, at the end of your presentation, again, you mentioned that a possible extension of your work would be to compare the literature you have been analyzing with literature from other parts of the Global South. But what about comparison with urban writing in and from the West? I was thinking, as you were talking in particular about the novels by John Fante on New York, which I think belong very much to the epic. I mean, which certainly contributed to shaping my representation of New York much before I went to the city, and very much, pushed me to romanticize everything that looks made out of steel. So yeah.
Thanks. I insisted on the fact that these are critical texts, and I mean critical in the sense of critical of the uneven urban development that is going on. But it's actually a question I'm asking myself now, whether you could think of the epic and the ordinary modes, or in other texts which are not necessarily critical of uneven development. Would that, are these modes necessarily critical or not? And I think there are, I mean, there was sort of boom of nonfiction about, but not necessarily about Indian cities, but about India's so-called arrival or emergence by Indian writers. I showed a few of them in the slide about nonfiction, but these I would call them, non-critical texts, or even texts that celebrate the so-called advent of India as a new global power. And in the case of cities, I think in perhaps in popular nonfiction, and I think there's a question of periodization as well. Perhaps, I mean, I would say that there are perhaps less and less of course, again, it's ambiguous. Let's say celebratory texts about urbanization in India, from the 2010s onwards. I think it was easier to be optimistic, perhaps, before, even though this is debatable. One example of fiction, which contrasts with the text I study, is Diksha Basu's The Windfall, which describes the sudden a family encountering sudden wealth and then moving to Noida or Gurgaon. And in this case, there's no real indictment of these new urban developments. There's a sort of it's a sort of morality tale, because in the end, the idea is that the values you have to cherish are those of family and community, as opposed to a sort of perhaps artificial modernity. But it's a different kind of criticism based on perhaps on conservative values, not on radical values. And then we could also think of genre fiction, and this is something I haven't investigated, but I would love to, like chick lit or even crime fiction. I'm quite interested in crime fiction written by women in particular. So the way they look at, urban modernization could be interesting, because some of them would emphasize perhaps the way it has led to emancipation for women, or emphasizing this aspect over another. So it, yeah. And then, yeah, comparison with the West or the global North, I think it makes sense because these writers, these Indian writers I study, are very much, they are shaped by their reading of Indian literature, sometimes in Indian languages, but also, you know, they are English educated, so their lineage is also Euro-American. Aman Sethi again quotes American journalists investigating work, and you know, I think at first I couldn't help but see connections between I don't know, even Suketu Mehta and Charles Dickens, for instance. But this is very common, and sometimes it's used as a shortcut. So I think we need to be careful with those comparisons because we don't want to use them in a sort of stagist way. We don't want to say that Suketu Mehta's Mumbai is like 19th century Dickens London. But yeah, I mean, there are very fruitful comparisons to be made. I think because I work with the world system theory, I do think that these comparisons make sense. But we need to bear in mind that the contradictions of capitalist modernization are exacerbated, I think, in India or in cities of the global south. I think these do not belong to a different sphere, but the effects are perhaps more visible than in London or in Paris. But I do think that, yeah, they are connected in literary terms and in material terms as well.
Okay. I think we will take one last question from Tangavelu, if I'm right. So Tangavelu, do you want to ask your question? I'm not sure, actually, I completely understand it. So it would be great if you could ask it yourself. Yeah. Okay. Okay, you can speak now.
Yeah. Actually, that's whatever the narratives explained in Epic, people are really remember of it to a particular extent to beyond that period. It will be actual narratives they explain in reality. So that's the main thing for all Epic, whatever it's narrated in Epic. I don't know why this is happening. People are already educated in all sense. Why is it happening? I don't know. Just I asked the questions relating with that because it's being elaborated very nicely by her. So that I just explained this. I raised a question on this. Thanking you for.
What epic do you have in mind? I'm not sure I completely.
Yeah, it's all narratives, It's whatever the epic. In reality, it's whatever the epic is in our existence. All kind of literature and religious, and all these things are almost related to the particular extent. After the narrative epics is explained, it will be going on forever. That's the main thing, So I don't know why is it happening. People are already realized that it is a real story. Epics are all real stories. So why it's following later on by the people and the followers of the epics in that sense? Just I raise a question because already we know that it is the story only. It's whatever the epic is explained is the story. So just I want to get that and explain the people how if these being real in actual sense, and that's the thing I want to raise the question. It's already we know that. So just I raise the question among the I like people like him.
I'm not sure I understood everything, but I think you contrast the the epic with reality, or with what's going
Yeah,
on
yeah,
for real. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
In the cities. Um, I don't think that. I mean, I understand the epic as an aesthetic mode. It's true. Again, I don't.
Yeah, yeah. Just
It's
you explain.
and I don't think it distorts reality. Oh, I mean, it's a way of refracting
Right.
reality, just like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
ordinary mode is a way of refracting reality. Because I think that the text always,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think of a text as a document or as a sheer reflection of reality. It's always a
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
even
yeah.
with nonfiction, it's always,
Yes, of
that's
course.
the basic
Hmm.
work
Because
or
when,
process that the text
hmm.
that literature is about. It's not
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
reflecting.
Hmm.
So, but perhaps there's I don't know, there might be a rising success of epic forms,
Yeah,
perhaps more
whatever.
than
But in
more.
reality, it's entirely different. Already we know that we the people know certain things, what is actually happening in real sense, and what is happening in that epic and all the other kind of stories. So just I want to raise the question because it's almost related. You have explained very neatly on this. You explain in detail with a practical approach where you study all the practical implications of the same. So just I raise the question as for sharing my thought on it. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have one real last question by Pato again. So Pato, I think it's better if you ask your question yourself.
Let me see if the audio is better this time. Is it?
It is.
Okay. Thanks, Marian. I was just following the discussion. I was just trying to understand how much weight you would give to globalization and capitalism, in the sense that for these kinds of conflicts that you see in these books to work themselves out, I mean, could they take place without globalization in a world that's completely sort of autarkic in some sense? And especially in a country like India, where you could have capitalism that get leavened by caste and gender and other kinds of other changes that's taking other axes, so to speak. So, I mean, just as you read through them and as you sort of, and this sort of, I think, links back to the earlier discussion on how these things travel. And as a novelist, and especially a number of these novelists who, even sort of Mahesh Rao was sort of born and brought up outside of India and so on and so forth. So is it that the globalization sort of milieu makes it easier for these things to travel, or do you think they are an intrinsic and essential component of the kind of conflict that you are trying to uncover in these novels?
I think of so when I say global, I think of capitalism as a global process right from the start, right? Because I draw on Immanuel Wallerstein's historical understanding of capitalism as it has been used by the Warwick Research Collective, for instance. So I think it's very difficult to think of these spaces outside global capitalism, even though it's not the only. I mean, even though that being said, it unfolds in different ways in different places. And in fact, in India, I think the way it connects or it meets with caste dynamics or gender dynamics are very specific. But in the case of these novels, I think they are embedded in these logics. I emphasize this in my research because the writers themselves, at least part of them, thematized, globalization. So that's why I think it required me to engage with these questions. But it would be very interesting to look at how cities are represented, post-independence, for instance, or I mean, even during the during the nationalist movement. I would be very interested in looking at these urban representations under a different kind of government, even though I don't consider this period to be outside of capitalism, but in a different political dispensation. I think it would be interesting. And I think the question of caste is very significant because there's a book called Untouchable Fictions, which argue that Anglophone Indian writing tends to overlook caste and to foreground class and community as lenses through which we can look at Indian society. And this book argues that it's because it's easier for foreign readers to understand India through class and community rather than caste. But I think in the case of Arundhati Roy or even Siddharth Chaudhury's writing, caste is very much shown to permeate everyday social relationships, and they show how it has sort of it has morphed, or it has with liberalization. So I think they are also very attuned to local social dynamics, which are not which cannot be subsumed under the idea of capitalism. I don't know if I make sense. But the book Untouchable Fictions is very interesting in that sense. The idea of caste being eclipsed in Anglophone writing by class and community.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. That was a really fascinating conversation, and thank you for suggesting so many books and authors on the way. I think this is really, very interesting. Sunil was asking how can we get some of the references you mentioned, etc. So I took the liberty of giving him your email address, but I mean, your professional address is very easy to find if one Googles you. So I think that probably the best way. And so I think we're really looking forward to,
maybe Marianne should just share a reading list that we can put along with the video in the talk list.
When we put the video online, you mean, Pato?
Yes, so I'm saying that we could, in the description, we could put down a list of books that you've been looking at that might be an interesting resource for engagement.
I could also add a slide to the PowerPoint at the end with references. But
okay, that would be great. So Marianne, just send it to us, I mean to Mukta and I, and we'll add it to the video when the video will be put on the website of the CPR. So thank you again, and we're looking forward to reading your book. So all the best for that, and thank you, and bye-bye everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for all your comments and questions. Very helpful.
Okay.
Bye.